course of the last lessons, we traced at great length the course that the Great Revolt of 1857 had taken. We learnt about the different policies and laws and reforms which were implemented by the British East India Company and how those stood as very important reasons behind the outbreak of the Revolt of 1857. Though the Revolt of 1857 failed in the long run to expel the Britishers from the Indian subcontinent, it nevertheless shook the foundation of the British East India Company. At this point of time, the British Parliament realized that the Indian subcontinent cannot be ruled in the way it has been done for over a century. That is to say, the East India Company's policies and reforms and ideas and rules were actually failing to rule and conquer the masses in the Indian subcontinent. And it is for this reason that various new kinds of policies were implemented subsequent to the Revolt of 1857. So this lesson will be devoted to understanding the aftermath of the Revolt of 1857. So let us now begin this discussion on the long-term implications that the Revolt of 1857 had in the Indian subcontinent's politics. Now at this point of time, the British Parliament realized that the British East India Company, which was initially a trading company, failed to rule the masses of the Indian subcontinent. Its policies were failing. Those were not well suited to the Indian masses, which is why now the British Crown directly started ruling India. How was this done? To this end, the Government of India Act was passed in 1858, and this was a very significant moment in the history of the subcontinent, because with the passing of the Government of India Act in 1858, the governance of India now went under the direct control of the British Crown. So previously it was the British East India Company that was ruling the Indian subcontinent following the Battle of Plassey that had happened in 1757. But after a whole century, the British Parliament realized that this rule cannot happen any longer, which is why now the British Crown directly started controlling the Indian subcontinent, and in this regard it was the Government of India Act 1858 that was very crucial for the country's politics. Now when the Government of India Act was passed in 1858, Queen Victoria was proclaimed the Empress of India. So here you can see an illustration of how Queen Victoria is being worshipped as the Empress of India. She is being gifted lavish gifts which are being taken to her from India. So at this point of time, it was no longer the British East India Company that was in charge of the subcontinent. Instead, it was directly the British Crown and the British Parliament that now began to rule the Indian subcontinent. Now the British Crown now devised many strategies to rule the Indian subcontinent properly, because it was no longer willing to have its rule fail in the subcontinent. It was wanting to strengthen and further re-establish its rule in the subcontinent. And to this end, the responsibility of governing India was allotted to the Secretary of State for India. So the Secretary of State for India was a member of the British Parliament, and this member of the British Parliament was appointed to govern India properly. And after that, the Secretary of State for India was to be assisted by the India Council. Now the India Council was made up of British officers who had served and worked in the Indian subcontinent for more than 10 years. So what can we understand from this? From this, what we can infer is that the British Crown was trying to establish and strengthen its authority in the Indian subcontinent. It was trying to understand and well govern the people in the lands, which is why this India Council was now supposed to help and assist the Secretary of State for India in his governance of the Indian subcontinent. Now we learned that it was the Governor General who was at the head of the British East India Company. But after the Government of India Act was passed in 1858, the Governor General of India was given the title of Viceroy. Now this Viceroy was very different from the position of the Governor General, because the Governor General was the head of the British East India Company, and mind you, this was a trading company initially. But now the Viceroy became a direct representative of the British Crown. So it was the British Crown that now directly began to control the Indian subcontinent, and the Viceroy was to be appointed as the direct representative of the British Crown in the Indian subcontinent. Now at this point of time, it was Lord Canning who became the first Viceroy of India. Now Indian subcontinent has witnessed many viceroys coming to power till India gained its independence from British rule in 1947. And Lord Canning became the first Viceroy of India, and let me give you an important information in this regard. It was Lord Mountbatten who was the last Viceroy of India before India got its independence in 1947. Before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. Who was the first Viceroy of India? Was it Lord Wellesley, Lord Canning, Lord Dalhousie or Lord Revolt? Well, the correct answer is Lord Canning. He became the first Viceroy of India. When the British Crown started ruling the Indian subcontinent, it was initially learning from the mistakes that the British East India Company had made. Now the British East India Company, through several policies like subsidiary alliance or even the doctrine of lapse, was actually annexing the territories of several Rajas and local Nawabs and kings. And in this way, the East India Company had actually incurred the wrath and anger of these local ruling chiefs, which is why all these local ruling chiefs were up in arms against the British East India Company during the Revolt of 1857. Now the British Crown realized that it should not repeat the same mistake, which is why all ruling chiefs of the country were assured at this point of time that their territory would never be annexed in future. So this was a mistake that the British East India Company had made. But now at this point of time, the British Crown assured the ruling chiefs that their territories would not be annexed to the British rule in the Indian subcontinent. After this, the indigenous rulers were also allowed to pass on their kingdoms to their heir, including adopted sons. Now this was a very radical thing to be done by the British Parliament. Why is it so? We learned that it was the policy of doctrine of lapse that maintained that if any ruler or any Raja or any Nawab died without a natural male heir to the throne, then his territory would be annexed to the British East India Company. We have also learnt about how bravely Rani Lakshmi Bai had fought against the Britishers simply because her adopted son Damodar Rao was not officially recognized as an heir to the throne. But now, at this point of time, when the local ruling chiefs were assured that their territories would not be annexed in future, they were also allowed to pass on their kingdoms to their heirs, and these heirs also included their adopted sons. But do you think the British rule suddenly became very liberal in the Indian subcontinent? Because all this while the British East India Company was implementing many draconian and oppressive policies on the masses of the subcontinent. But suddenly the British rule in India became very liberal in the sense that the local ruling chiefs were assured that their territories would not be annexed, and at the same time they were also allowed to pass pass on their kingdoms to their heirs? Was it done in a very positive light by the Britishers? Most definitely not, because the Britishers were actually wanting to subordinate the Indian rulers. So the Indian rulers were to become subordinates to the British crown. How was this to be done? These rulers were to acknowledge the British Queen as their sovereign paramount. So it was the British Queen who was at the helm of power in the Indian subcontinent from this point of time. And these local rulers were simply the subordinates of the British Queen. They were to acknowledge the British Queen as their sovereign paramount. That is to say, these local ruling chiefs, though they had their own territories, actually lost their autonomy to the British Queen. You must have heard a statement that goes like this: mistakes make a human perfect. Well, at this point of time, the British Crown was trying to do this. That is, learn from the mistakes that were made by the British East India Company. Now, the British East India Company did not allow Indian sepoys in the British Indian Army to wear their sectarian marks, to wear their religious identity markers. Now, this was also a major reason behind the dissatisfaction and discontentment among the Indian sepoys who were serving in the British Indian Army. But at this point of time, the British rule in the subcontinent decided to follow a policy of non-intervention in religious and social matters. We learned that various oppressive practices like sati, female infanticide, among many others, have been prevalent in the Indian subcontinent since ages. Now, these practices are very oppressive in the truest sense of the term, but the people of the Indian subcontinent have been very attached and associated with these practices. Now, when these practices were being abolished through several social reforms, the British East India Company was beginning to be resented by the conservative sections of the Indian societies. And at this point of time, the British Crown now realized that it should not interfere in any kind of religious matters. That is to say, the Indian masses would take care of their own religious matters, and the British rule would not interfere in the same. And at the same time, social matters of the people in India were also not to be interfered upon by the British rule. Here you can see how members of the Punjab regiment soldiers were now allowed to wear community marks like the turban or the beard. Now, this was a major issue behind the outbreak of the revolt of 1857, because the Indian sepoys were not allowed to wear the turban or keep the beard or wear other sectarian marks. But from this point of time, members of the Punjab regiment were allowed to wear the community markers. A point that we have been harping upon all along is that several sections of the Indian society were up in arms against the British East India Company during the revolt of 1857. Now, during this time, it were the zamindars and the landlords who were also affected by the economic policies which were brought into being by the British East India Company. But after the British Crown started ruling the Indian subcontinent, it formulated policies that protected landlords and zamindars and gave them security rights over their lands. Now, why do you think this was done? This was also done with a very negative intention. This was done in order to pit these landlords and zamindars against the peasants. Now, if the landlords and zamindars, who were in ways more than one exploitative in nature, were given security over their lands, if their interests were taken care of, then they would show the peasants their place. And so the peasants would be pitted against the zamindars and landlords. Now, the peasants had played a very crucial role in the revolt of 1857, and by securing the rights of the landlords and the zamindars, the British rule actually tried to thwart any uprising or rebellion from the peasants, because these zamindars and landlords would be able to better exploit the peasants, and the peasants poor as they were, would not get any option to form any kind of rebellion, to go up in arms against the British rule in the Indian subcontinent. We have learned how the revolt of 1857 actually began as a mutiny, and it was one soldier, Mangal Pandey to be specific, who had actually began this huge revolt. And for this reason, the Britishers realized the very crucial role played by the Indian sepoys in the revolt of 1857. And to this end, the number of Indian soldiers in the British Indian Army was reduced from this point of time. That is to say, the number of British soldiers were increased in British Indian Army regiments. So there was supposed to be more numbers of British soldiers. Lesser number of Indian soldiers in the British Indian Army regiments would also mean lesser chances of any kind of rebellion and uprisings from the Indian sepoys. Now, no Indian soldier was admitted into the military officer class. Now, Indian soldiers were restricted to a certain position only. It were the British soldiers who became the military officers. And by this, they also wanted to maintain a hierarchy within the British Indian Army regiments, because the Indian soldiers were not to be given the higher ranks. They were supposed to be subordinated to the British soldiers. And these Indian soldiers were prevented from possessing any sophisticated weaponry. Now, access to better weaponry, better arms and ammunitions also play a very crucial role in the outbreak of any rebellion or any warfare. But by preventing the possession of any sophisticated weaponry, the British rule actually wanted to ensure that the Indian soldiers got no way to be up in arms against the British rule. Then discord was sown by giving preference to certain castes and communities while recruiting the soldiers. How was this done? Now, when the soldiers were recruited, it were the Sikhs, the Gorkhas, the Jats who were given preferences. And in this way, the British rule was trying to pit these soldiers against each other. They were also trying to break the unity of the Indian soldiers. After this, the policy of balance and counter check was implemented. Now, how was this done? Allow me to give you an example in this regard. Suppose an Indian soldier hails from Punjab, and that person was recruited to the Bengal regiment. Then that person would have to serve for the British rule in faraway land, because Bengal is quite at a distance from Punjab. And in this way, that person who would be uprooted from his own place, that is, he would be sent away from Punjab to Bengal, would have no local sentiments to share with the people of Bengal. And so there will be no element of unity among these soldiers. So the soldiers were recruited to far off places from their own regions. And all this was done with the single intention of breaking the unity of Indian soldiers who had played a very crucial role in the revolt of 1857. The British held the Muslims responsible for the revolt, and they treated them with suspicion and hostility. The Britishers were of the opinion that the Muslims had played a very negative role, and that is how the revolt of 1857 had broken out. And these were actually ways to divide the population of the Indian society, because when the Muslims were treated with suspicion, the Hindus were given certain privileges with regard to job and employment opportunities. And by availing these opportunities, the conditions of the Hindus were getting better. While at the same time, since these Muslims were treated with suspicion and hostility, their conditions were further worsening. And because of this reason, anger, envy, resentment were brewing up in the minds of the Muslim community in the Indian subcontinent. The Hindus and the Muslims together were united during the revolt of 1857, and this severely angered the British officials. They realized that they would have to do something to break the unity. But how can this be done? How can the masses be divided? And for this reason now came into being a new policy of divide and rule that divided the Hindus from the Muslims. So the policy of divide and rule was as shrewd as it can be, because through this policy communal sentiments were now infused in the minds of these people. The Hindus were made to think against the Muslims, and the Muslims were made to think against the Hindus. So the unity that existed between them was broken up and they were divided. And this policy of divide and rule actually played a very crucial role in separating the masses of the Indian subcontinent. This is because the Muslims were filled with anger and resentment and envy against the Hindus, and the Hindus were also filled with bitter feelings and negative feelings against the Muslims. Now, communal sentiments have been very important in the partition of the Indian subcontinent as well. And communalism still continues to play an important role in Indian politics even today. And the foundation of these communal sentiments could be found in the policy of divide and rule that was being implemented subsequent to the revolt of 1857. So this now brings us to an end of our discussion on the aftermath of the revolt of 1857. Though the revolt of 1857 wasn't very successful in the long run in driving away the Britishers from the Indian subcontinent, it had long-lasting implications. Firstly, the Indian subcontinent now started to be ruled by the British Crown. It ceased to be any longer under the control of the British East India Company. Many new policies were implemented, many new reforms were brought into being, and these reforms and policies were initially shown to be of the interests of the Indian masses, but unfortunately enough, these policies were actually to serve the interests of the British Crown. The masses were exploited, and the masses were divided on the basis of their religion. The Hindus and the Muslims were divided, and they were filled with negative sentiments and hatred against each other. Following the revolt of 1857, a new phase of history began, because the Indian politics now took a new turn. Nationalistic sentiments now started growing in the minds of those masses who were very unhappy with India being ruled by the British Crown. And after the revolt of 1857, all these nationalistic sentiments now started brewing up, and these gave way to the formation of many nationalistic movements, and nationalistic rebellions were coming to being. So the revolt of 1857 had been a turning point in the history of the politics of the Indian subcontinent under British rule. With this, we conclude our discussion on the revolt of 1857, its causes, the course it took, and its aftermath. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million-plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.